The Dukeries of Nottinghamshire, a further dip into this book that talks about some of the most important buildings and places and estates in northern Nottinghamshire, but also we're going to see now some of the lesser places. So we're going to look today at Chapter 9, Far Flung Estates. About the heart of what is to become known as the Dukeries are ranged many lesser estates, established by the nobility and gentry through the centuries, and particularly in the last 200 years. Those estates furthest away from the heart of the Old Forest and therefore some distance from the poorest sandstone country, these occupy fertile, well-watered lowlands reaching to the western bank of the Trent. There is only one sufficient space here to mention some of the largest of these lesser estates. The logical way is to visit them in some sort of geographical sequence. To describe them in any other way would be at least confusing to the reader who didn't know them well already. Shire Oaks Hall, a matter of 2 miles to the northwest of Workshop, sans Shire Oaks, beside the River Ryton as it winds along its barely perceptible valley. The place got its name from oaks which stood where the 3 counties of Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire and the West Riding came together. In medieval times, Shire Oaks was the property of Worksop Priory, and at the dissolution in 1546 was granted to the Thornhills. Later in the century it was bought by the Hewitt family, ancestors of the Dukes of Leeds. The Shire Oaks estate was purchased by the Duke of Norfolk and sold, with Worksop Manor, to the 4th Duke of Norfolk in 1840. In 1854 he had work started on sinking shafts, and less than 5 years later the top hard coal was reached at a depth of 510 yards. This pioneer effort gained for the Duke a medal at the 1862 exhibition for proving the existence of a large coalfield under the Permian measures. In 1864 the colliery was sold to the Shire Oaks Colliery Company, and the former rural village became the first colliery settlement of the area. 2 miles to the west of Shire Oaks one is out in the countryside at the pretty village of Thorpe Salvin. At the Domesday Survey the place was part of the manor of Lawton, whose overlord was the great Norman knight Roger de Buseley. Before 1400 the Salvain family lived at the hall, moving away in that year and being replaced by the Sandfords. Brian Sandford pulled the ancient hall down and had it rebuilt about 1570. Some 30 years later, the Osborne family, later to become the Dukes of Leeds, acquired Thorpe Salvin Hall. Sir Thomas Osborne rose to fame and was created Duke of Leeds. The hall was no longer equal to his situation, and he had a far larger mansion erected at nearby Kiverton Park, long ago demolished, and vacated Thorpe Salvin in 1697. The 3-storied house has been empty ever since, and today only the south wall rears above a forgotten garden and lovely 2-storied gatehouse. The country rolls northwards from Thorpe Salvin, with arable farming important and a scatter of small woods. The shallow trough in which runs the Anston Brook, headwater of the River Ryton, contains South Anston and its decorated parish church of St. James in palest Magnesian limestone. Up the hill again and so to Dinnington, dominated now by the 267-foot-high colliery tip. This covers 54 acres and contains 5 million cubic yards of pit waste. Dinnington Hall has lost its glory with the coming of housing estates all about it. The present front of the house dates from the late 18th century and shows the distinct influences of Payne and Carr. The Aythorpe family lived here, and the house was purchased from them by the National Coal Board. The great sweep of the colliery tip rears to the northwest of Dinnington. From its summit, 590 feet above sea level, one looks out over the level landscape from the same altitude as the top of the Blackpool Tower. 3/4 of a mile to the northeast stood Thropeham Manor, part of the old house visible through the enclosing trees from the tip-top perch. Sam Skinner, owner of Waleswood Colliery, lived here for many years until his death at the outbreak of World War II. The manor was used by the military until the end of the war and in due course was taken over as part of Dinnington High School for rural studies teaching. This use came to an end, and when we came to explore the old house in the summer of 1972, it was being demolished. The site is now marked by levelled magnesian limestone rubble and remnants of old estate walls. The outstanding feature of any view from the top of Dinnington Colliery Tip is the parish church of Lawton and Lamorthen, light in the morning, with its splendid spire piercing the broad sky a mile to the north. It is probably the finest spire of any church in South Yorkshire. A pleasant lane slips gently away from Lawton toward the east, and in 2.5 miles comes to Furbeck. In the wooded parkland to the right of the road stood Park Hill, former home of Colonel St. Leger, who inaugurated a sweepstake for 3-year-olds over a 2-mile course in 1776. It has been named after its originator ever since, and is held each year at the Doncaster September meeting. Park Hill was demolished before the last war. Just down the lane to the north stands Furbeck Hall, an early 18th century house which, according to Pevner, was rudely Elizabethanized by adding a number of steep gables in the middle of the last century. Formerly the home of the Jebb family, it became in turn a country club and a National Coal Board rehabilitation hospital. The little water which flows eastwards through the grounds of Furbeck Park has drained the broad countryside about Lawton and Lamorthen, and has come down this way through a beautiful gorge in the magnesian limestone. In 1147, Richard de Bousely founded a Cistercian abbey here at Roche, named from the pale rocks which enclose the site, so making this the earliest established monastic foundation in the area covered by this book. Rufford was established a year later with the Cistercians, and Welgate and Newstead followed. Here, in a sylvan setting not bettered anywhere in these islands, the builders of Roche Abbey used true Gothic designs. After the dissolution by King Henry VIII, the ruins of Roche lay neglected, though the lands associated with it were used, bought, and sold several times. Neighbouring Sandbeck was perhaps a bailiff's house. The Sanderson family bought it and were created Earls of Castleton, and in 1723 the Sandbeck estate was left to the Earls of Scarborough. In 1774, Capability Brown charged £3,000 to landscape the site of Roche Abbey. This included covering the lower portions of the ruins and grassing them over so that only a few larger remnants of the abbey reared above a picturesque landscape. Between 1908 and 1920, these hidden ruins were excavated to reveal the detail that is visible today. In 1928, Roche Abbey was handed over to the Ministry of Works and is now open for inspection by the public. No picture remains as to show what the original Sandbeck Hall looked like. As mentioned above, the Scarboroughs came here in 1723, and about 1763, James Payn was responsible for the present house. It is perhaps the most dramatic of all of his designs, a great portico of Corinthian columns looking out over the lakes to the east. It was a truly delightful March afternoon when I first came to Sandbeck, an oasis of peace and rural picturesque, with 4 collieries within a very short distance. Sandbeck Park could easily be set in 18th century Sussex. Waterfowl were busy upon the lake, and the overhangs of willow were yellow with swathen leaf buds. The pale house rises surprisingly high above its level surroundings. During the 19th century, what has been described as an unfortunate one-storied projection was built onto the middle of the entrance, the west front, but this seems nicely to break up any feeling of uniformity on this side of the house. In 1869, the lovely chapel was built to the north of the house, and in 1955, the low wing between house and chapel was demolished. An interesting feature of the chapel is a small west window in pastel shades of glass, which came from Roche Abbey in 1884. Alfred Lumley was the 10th Earl of Scarborough. His younger brother died at Rufford Abbey in 1923, and upon Aldred's death in 1945, his nephew succeeded as 11th Earl. The 12th Earl succeeded on the death of his father in 1969. He was brought up at Lumley Castle, County Durham, and in India until 1943, coming to Sandbeck at the age of 12 when his father succeeded to the title. The estate has an area of about 5,000 acres, of which about 1,000 are owned by the Earl and the rest is woodland or is rented to tenants. This is arable and beefland, and much of the parkland has been reclaimed for agriculture. There is some shooting done still, some by the family, and some let out. From the high ground to the southeast of Sanderbeck Hall, in the shadow of great trees planted when Capability Brown applied his skills to the estate 2 centuries ago, one gets a fine view down to the mansion and glimpses of the lake. A mile away to the southeast of our vantage point is Oldcoats, site of one of Bess of Hardwicke's building ventures. Oldcoats was one of the great Elizabethan houses of the region, but nothing remains today. However, 3 miles away to the east there is another estate of illustrious past and present romance. It is Selby Hall, a little more than 2 miles north of Blyth, near a bend in the River Ryton. This is well-wooded countryside, saved from the continuous flatness of the district farther north by the gentle valleys of the River Idle and its tributary the Ryton. The woods about Selby are reminiscent of the forest which once covered all this region. After the Norman conquest, Selby was granted to Roger de Bousely of Tickhill Castle, just over the county border in South Yorkshire. The de Selby family held the manor there for several centuries. In 1627, Thomas Selby sold the estate to William Saunderson of Blyth, an elder brother of the Bishop of Lincoln. It stayed in the hands of this family for 4 generations, and then, in 1725, was bought by John Monckton of Hodroyd Hall near Barnsley. He later married Elizabeth Manners, daughter of the Duke of Rutland. At that time, the estate was 846 acres in area, the mansion occupying a position to the northeast of the present house. Later, it became the Stewart House, more recently a restaurant for visitors, and now lies empty. The most distinguished member of the Monckton family was Sir Philip, knighted for his support of Charles I during the Civil War and created 1st Viscount Galway. Despite the title, the family has no Irish connections. James Payne was employed to create the new Selby Hall using an eccentric design. It consisted of a brick-built central block with lower wings to east and west, and was constructed between 1750 and 1765. It has been claimed that the design of the house was long out of date by 1800, with an offensive and wasteful roof upon the central block. So it was that in 1812, the 5th Viscount Galway demolished the east and west wings and had the central block remodelled so that Selby became a quite inoffensive building, compact and much more convenient. It remains without as a rather unoriginal building in the Adam style, but for me it has about it the melancholy air of so much of the faded glory of rural Nottinghamshire. It is not known who planned the park. Originally, the garden occupied the south front, where a great cedar of Lebanon, planted when this new Selby was under construction, still grows close to the house. Now the main gardens fall eastwards. They are the creation of the late Viscountess Galway, wife of the 7th Viscount. Here there are good herbaceous borders and lawns and tree-shaded pools. The estate grew to 10,000 acres, but today is only 2,000 in area. The home farm of 800 acres is all that is farmed by the Galways. A mile to the north, Harworth Colliery was sunk on part of the former estate. The present main entrance was built onto the eastern end of the house in 1911 by the 7th Viscount to give a more imposing entree. It features a great entrance hall which contains the state coach of the Galways, built by Turner in 1800. The small drawing room on the south front is the most intact Payne room. It is next to the library, where the Dowager Viscountess Galway lives today. Herein is a fine collection of etui, gold boxes and watches, and 18th century miniatures of the family. Through a panel of the library's west wall, one reaches the oak room, panelled with timber brought from Hodroyd Hall. The most important relic of this lovely room is the ring given by Charles I to Sir Philip Monckton on the battlefield at Marston Moor. George Edmund Milnes Monckton Arundel, born 1844, succeeded in 1876 to become the 7th Viscount Galway. He became Master of Foxhounds of Lord Galway's pack in 1876, and in 1907, when he retired, sold his hounds to Earl Fitzwilliam and lent the kennels built by the 6th Viscount Galway at Selby for the continued use of the pack. The 8th Viscount was George Vere Arundel, 1882 to 1943, who served in the army until 1928. In 1935, he became Governor-General of New Zealand and 6 years later returned to a small house in Selby Park. The army occupied Selby Hall during World War II, and in 1946 the Dowager Viscount Galway, widowed 3 years, moved there and has lived there ever since. As an illustration of how the lifestyle of noble families has changed in the past half-century, Selby is a good example. Lady Galway has recorded for me how comprehensive the staff was when she first married. Beside an interior staff of a dozen, 3 or 4 housemaids and 3 or 4 kitchen maids, 3 or 4 butlers, there was also a blacksmith, carpenter, bricklayer, odd job man, chauffeur, and 6 or 7 gardeners. In the summer of 1972, there was a cook and a housemaid, complemented by a gardener assisted by casual help. The head butler died that year after 54 years of service. The chauffeur had died after 50 years' service, and the stud groom and head gardener had each worked 50 years. Though the house is no longer open to the public because of the problems of finding sufficient part-time help, the gardens are opened periodically under the Queen's nursing scheme. The present Viscount Galway is a distant cousin of the late Viscount and has no direct connections with the estate. The Dowager Viscountess lives on alone here, and in due course her granddaughter will come to Selby. Standing remotely at the centre of a low country between Blyth and Worksop is Hodsop Priory, a misnomer for it has no direct connection with the church. It has a 400-year-old gatehouse, but the present house dates from the last century. The notable Mellish family, long associated with Blyth, lived here. 2 miles to the west, beyond the A60 road between Worksop and Doncaster, stands Langold Lake and the surrounding parkland, which is open to the public during daylight hours. Langold Hall was to have been a large, late Victorian house, but was never completed owing to the death of the owner during the Boer War. Almost adjoining this estate to the south is Walling Wells, where at the time of writing decay is rife. This is another estate which has seen far better days. A large house stood here in medieval times, but the present one appears to be a tasteless Regency or early Victorian, a sad jumble of gables and unsteady chimney stacks and cracking stucco. This was formerly the house of Sir Thomas White, but is now a conglomeration of flats, encircled by old cars, caravans, and rank wasteland. An entirely different atmosphere pervades the broad vale of the River Ryton, 2 miles east of Worksop, to the north of the A620 road. Here stands Osberton Hall, the centre of an estate of some 12,000 acres, which has an interesting past and a healthy present. It is recorded that before 1066, this land was held by Elwain and Uluit. As with so much in this district, Osberton was swallowed up by the de Busley family of Tickhill. During the reign of Henry VIII, the estate came to the Bolus family, and later to the Thorners and Hewitts, the latter of Shyoaks, mentioned earlier in this chapter. The daughter of Sir Thomas Hewitt married Frances Ferrard Foljambe, and so in 1784 this illustrious family came to the estate which is still in their possession. Robert White records that the Foljambes are a very ancient family, and in all probability they came from the little Derbyshire hamlet of Moor Hall, west of Chesterfield. They resided at Walton Hall, Chesterfield, and later at Alderk Hall, Rotherham, but Osberton became the favourite house of the family. Aldwark was increasingly less attractive as industrialisation grew about it, and after demolition in 1899, the site was used for the Parkgate Steelworks. It is now hard to imagine the former rural peace of the district. William Wilkins was employed to remodel and greatly enlarge Osberton Hall to a mansion of 100 rooms between 1798 and 1800. The Scofton estate, adjoining the River Ryton, was purchased and added to Osberton, the estate houses being placed at Scofton and the grounds laid out. In 1814, Frances Ferrard Foljambe died. his grandson George Saville Foljambe succeeding to the estate. He was notable for two things: as a great horseman and master of the foxhounds, and for his modifications to the estate. Most notable was the construction of the church at Scofton in 1833, designed by W. Poynter and showing an early appreciation of the Norman style. It stands close to the site of ancient Scofton Hall. Near the church are the remains of a kitchen garden and the glass houses constructed about the same time at a surprising distance from Osberton. They are a pathetic reminder of more affluent times, when time and labour were cheap. In 1853, George Saville Foljambe had a kitchen wing and complete nursery floor added for his family by his second wife, the former Viscountess Milton. He was succeeded only by the son of his first marriage, Francis John Saville Foljambe, born 1830, great-grandfather of the present owner of Osberton. Besides being master of the Burton Hounds and Liberal MP for Redfern, this great Victorian was highly respected throughout the entire district by rich and poor alike. He married Lady Gertrude Aitchison and had 3 sons, the eldest of which married Dora Warr, daughter of Dr. Warr of Eton. He succeeded on the death of his father in 1917 and, dying 3 years later, was succeeded by his eldest son, Captain Edmund Foljambe, who lived at Osberton from 1920 to 1960, but died childless in that year. The estate then came to his nephew, G.M.T. Foljambe, who has lived at Osberton since 1960. Osberton Hall was a military hospital during World War II and was left without a coal ration in post-war years. By the end of the 40s, the building had almost reached the point of no return. Luckily, its new owner had sufficient imagination, courage, and feeling of custodianship to spend much time and money on restoration. The most notable interior feature of this house is what is perhaps the finest collection of stuffed British birds, formed originally by Francis Ferrard Foljambe from about 1800 and greatly extended by Francis John Saville Foljambe about a century ago. Robert White commented in 1876 that it contains a specimen of the now extinct bird, the great auk, and its egg. The glass-fronted cases holding this splendid collection line the walls of the great hall at the very centre of the house. Luckily, the birds were not adversely affected by wartime neglect. Today, the house stands in a perfectly renovated condition, perhaps in the finest condition of any large house of the area here described. Likewise, the estate is in first-class heart. Mr. G.M.T. Foljambe is a chartered land agent and runs his estate personally. There are 6,000 acres in hand, of which 1,000 are woodland. It is mixed farming country. Some sugar beet is grown, but some of the land consists of the notorious blow-away sand, and the distance from the nearest sugar factory at Newark makes this area on the fringe of what is viable because of transport costs. There has been much planting of windbreaks to cut down the effect of wind and to reduce the cutting of leaves, seedlings by the blown sand. The estate has one of the oldest Jersey herds in the country, and there is a stud of Cleveland Bay horses. Osberton has come to be associated in the last few years with the Osberton Horse Trials, which are run under British Horse Society rules. At the inaugural trials, Princess Anne had her first win on Dublé. Despite the changes of the last decade, there is an unchanging atmosphere about the estate, and glimpses of the great house across the broad ford over the River Ryton present an identical view to that seen in late Victorian times, in those true Aspidistra days. Away to the southeast, about 12 miles as the crow flies from Osberton, and 3 miles west of the Trent at Sutton-on-Trent, is the small and scattered red brick village called Ossington. At the Domesday survey, it was a clearing near the edge of Sherwood Forest, and much later a fine Elizabethan house stood on the same site as that of the more recent Ossington Hall. The old house was almost ruined in the Civil War by the Scots Army, based in the area during the siege of Newark. The estate came as a gift to the Knights Hospitaliers of Jerusalem, and at the dissolution in the 16th century to the relatives of Cranmer. Later it passed to the Cartwright family. In 1727, the recent house was built, a rather plain block of 9 bays, and supporting wings were added later in that century. There were later alterations during the last century. Excuse me. I just need to take some coffee. That's better. Later, it passed to the Cartwright family. In 1727, the recent house was built, a rather plain block of 9 bays, and supporting wings were added later in the century. There were later alterations during the last century. By the middle of the 18th century, the estate had come to the Denisons, wealthy Leeds wool merchants. In the years before his death in 1782, William Denison increased the value of the 370 acres of Ossington woodlands by several thousands of pounds. The timber always found a good market in his hometown of Leeds. He worked out a careful policy of felling and replanting, 15 or 16 acres of young timber being cut annually for hop poles and stakes, and larger timber floated down the Trent to Gainsborough. The value of Ossington Hall is said to have risen from £2,000 in 1759 to £10,000 in 1779. When William Denison died in 1782, his brother Robert commissioned the country's leading sculptor, Joseph Nollekens, to create a full-length statue which shows William reading a poem, and about his feet bales of wool, sheep, and a ship. Robert died a year later, and Nollekens executed a similar statue of him. The pair now adorn the west end of the interior of Ossington's parish church of the Holyrood, also of 1782. It is a delightful classical building on the site of an earlier place of worship. The most illustrious member of the family was Speaker of the House of Commons between 1857 and 1872, and was created the first and only Viscount Ossington. His wife was Charlotte Bentinck, daughter of the 4th Duke of Portland, and she became immensely wealthy when she inherited all the London property from her bachelor brother, the mysterious 5th Duke of Portland. The sad but elegant wellhead near the main gateway to Ossington Hall was erected by her to the memory of her nephew. In Ossington Church are memorials to Lieutenant Denison, killed during World War I. His father had died in 1916, but his mother lived on at the Hall until just before World War II. She had handed over the estate to her nephew in 1930. He was the late Lieutenant Colonel William Maxwell Evelyn Denison, a regular soldier between 1925 and 1935. During World War II, the hall was occupied by the Household Cavalry and others. Colonel Denison returned and recalled to me how he came to live in Ossington in 1946 and found it a virtual shambles. The great house was really beyond repair, and in 1959 he moved to the more modest and manageable Ossington House in the village. The hall was demolished in 1963 because no suitable buyer could be found. The stables and kitchen gardens were used until the end, and conifers and potatoes are still grown in surroundings reminiscent of an enchanted garden, forlorn yet beautiful, silent and quite still. In my explorations of this lonely domain, I came once across an old magnolia tree laden with blooms of palest pink, hidden from the general view by a dense tangle of forgotten trees. The estate has 3,600 acres, but all farmland is now let to tenants. Colonel Denison was a great-nephew of Speaker Denison, later the only Viscount Ossington, and was well known throughout Nottinghamshire as a magistrate and former master of foxhounds of the Rufford Hunt from 1947 to 1949. His sudden death in August 1972 on the way from York races was a shock to all who knew him. Only 5 miles to the southwest of Ossington is another old estate which has seen better days. There, at Winkburn, the great house still stands, though empty and very forlorn. The settlement has been described as one of Nottinghamshire's hidden villages, a forgotten sort of place in the country drained by the River Wink. At the middle of the 12th century, the village and the church were presented to the Knights Hospitallers of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. Today, the Church of St. John of Jerusalem is one of only 3 temple churches in Britain. It consists simply of a nave and chancel with a near-complete Norman tower. The ancient house was the local base for priests and knights of the Order of St. John. The Burnell family followed the knights as lords of the manor at the dissolution. The present Winkburn Hall dates from the early 18th century, a cubic building in red brick with large windows, and on the drive front a Tuscan porch supported by 4 columns. Colonel P. Burnell died after World War I, and an Australian relative succeeded him at Winkburn. At the end of the 1920s, the estate was sold and eventually became a preparatory school. The house has steadily decayed in the years since, with several subsequent owners, including the late Sir Stuart Goodwin. It now lies empty, facing out sadly across Winkburn Park towards Newark and the distant Trent. 2 miles west of forgotten Winkburn lies Kirklington, at the southern foot of a surprisingly steep and crumpled ridge between the Ollerton, Nottingham Road, Eakring and Maplebeck. The ridge reaches 385 feet above sea level near Duke's Wood, with a steep and wooded slope of 270 feet down to the River Greet at Kirklington. The parish church of St Swithin has an outstanding tower of 17th century brick rebuilt upon a medieval base. Kirklington Hall dates from the middle of the 18th century and has a rather unattractive exterior. It is now Rodney School. Far to the west, between Sutton in Ashfield and Hucknall Torkard, and edging upon the industrialised fringe of our district, stands the last estate, Annesley Park. This has medieval origins, but was altered and added to in the 16th and 17th centuries, and completely reconstructed in the last century. It is a rambling mansion, made all the more romantic by the ruins of the adjacent All Saints' Church. For many generations, the Chaworth Musters family have lived at Annesley. Members of the family are best remembered as sportsmen, both in the hunting field and as shots. In March 1973, Major R.P. Chaworth Musters sold the mansion to the Football Association and moved to the smaller and more attractive Felly Priory. This was an Augustinian priory founded in 1156 by Ralph Brito of Annesley. What exists today is a largely 17th century, an amalgam of pretty gables, roof angles and chimney stacks looking south-eastwards across the broad vale called the Dumbles to the remains of Beauville Priory, the only Carthusian religious house in Nottinghamshire and founded in 1343 by Nicholas de Cantilupe. The Dumbles slips down to the industry and unloveliness of the Erewash Valley, true D.H. Lawrence country and beyond the realm of the Dukeries. That was a really interesting read to look at some of the lesser estates. Let's have a glance at the photographs that are provided here. The top one is the south front of Thoresby Hall, seen from the banks of the River Medden in midwinter. Below this, we see the west front of Rufford Abbey today. On the left here, on this page 54, we see the east front of Sanderbeck Hall, seen across the lake in summertime. Below, we see Winter near Scofton Church on the Osberton estate. True Aspidistra country, it says. And it looks as though the conservatory there, or the orangery, has long since seen good times. On the right-hand page, 55, we see the south front of Selby Hall, home of the Dowager Viscount of Galway. And below this, Southwell Minster from the northeast, showing the late 13th century chapter house just here. And then the final 2 photographs within this chapter, the top one is the 14th century gatehouse of Worksop Priory. And then the final one, on page 56 at the base, Mr. Rupert Spencer conducting a sale of porcelain from Welbeck Abbey, June 1970. So that was chapter 9 from the Dukeries of Nottinghamshire, and this chapter was called Far-Flung Estates.